She held out one earbud without asking my name. The bus lights flickered off. Somewhere outside, Ohio disappeared into fog. "You'll like this song," she said. I didn't argue. 3 hours later, our hands were still touching. I didn't know her name yet. I already knew I was in trouble. By sunrise, she was gone. She left the earbud in my palm. 6 months later, she walked back into my life holding a guitar case. What she told me that night changed everything I thought I knew about love. My name is Maya Whitfield. And for 26 years I built my life around being careful, being quiet, being exactly who everyone in Peoria, Illinois expected me to be. That carefulness ended on a Greyhound bus somewhere between Columbus and Pittsburgh, on a night I only boarded because my connecting flight had been canceled. I sat by the window with a paperback I wasn't reading, watching my own reflection instead, when a stranger dropped into the seat beside me without asking. She smelled like rain and cheap coffee, and she was scribbling lyrics onto a napkin like the words might escape if she didn't catch them fast enough. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Every other seat's full. And I promise I don't bite unless the song's really bad." I laughed before I meant to. She grinned like she won something small but important. Her name was Sloane Carter. She told me, a musician heading to a gig in Pittsburgh nobody important would attend. She had callous fingers, a chipped front tooth, and eyes that studied me like I was a lyric she hadn't finished writing yet. "You look like someone who used to sing," she said, out of nowhere. And I didn't know how she guessed that about a stranger. I told her I quit choir at 19 when my mother said music wasn't a career, only a phase good girls grew out of. Sloane didn't argue with that. She just handed me one earbud and said, "Grow back into it for 3 minutes." The song was something slow and unfamiliar. A woman's voice cracking open on the chorus like she meant every word of it. "Who is this?" I asked. Sloane looked out the window instead of answering, which felt, even then, like its own kind of answer. We didn't talk about anything important after that. We talked about diners, dead phones, our worst haircuts, and whether Pittsburgh had good pierogies. Somewhere past Wheeling, West Virginia, my head found her shoulder without permission, and she didn't move away, didn't say a word, just let me stay. I woke up as the bus pulled into the station, disoriented and warm. Her jacket draped over me, though I never felt her take it off. "This is me," she said, gathering her guitar case, and for 1 second her hand hovered near mine like she wanted to write down my number. She didn't ask. I didn't offer. She pressed the single earbud into my palm instead, still warm, and disappeared into the crowd before I could speak. I told myself it meant nothing. A stranger on a bus. The kind of story you tell at parties and never think about again. I was wrong about that. The way I'd later learn I was wrong about most things I tried hard to convince myself of. For 6 months I kept that earbud in my nightstand drawer, refusing to admit why I couldn't throw away a single broken piece of plastic. My life in Chicago went on as scheduled. Shifts at the hospital, brunch with my mother, half-hearted dates with men who never made me forget an earbud. My mother, Carol, called every Sunday to ask if I'd met anyone serious, a word she used the way other people said acceptable. I worked as a labor and delivery nurse, a job I loved fiercely, mostly because for 12 hours at a time I got to think about someone besides myself. My best friend Renata teased me about Bus Girl every time I mentioned a song I couldn't identify, half convinced I'd invented the whole story. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in April, a poster outside a record shop on Damon Avenue stopped me cold. "Sloane Carter, live, tonight only." I stood on the sidewalk for 10 full minutes, arguing with myself, before I finally walked through the door like gravity had made the decision for me. The venue was small, maybe 80 people. String lights strung low over a stage barely larger than my kitchen table back home. When Sloane walked out with her guitar, she scanned the crowd once, the way performers do, and then her eyes stopped completely on me. She didn't miss a note, But her smile afterward told me she remembered exactly which stranger from a night bus was standing in her audience. After the set, she found me by the merch table, 2 beers already in her hands like she'd expected me the whole time. "You kept the earbud," she said, nodding at the single silver stud on the chain around my neck. And I felt caught in the best way. "You never told me your last name," I said. "Carter," she answered, "though most people just call me Trouble. If that helps." We talked until the venue staff started stacking chairs around us, and neither of us moved to leave. Like leaving might undo the whole night. She walked me to the train, hands in her jacket pockets, careful not to touch me, though I could feel how badly she wanted to. "Can I text you?" she asked at the platform, and I gave her my number before my brain finished deciding whether that was a good idea. That night I lay awake replaying every word she'd said, cataloging her laugh, and wondering when exactly I'd stop being careful with my heart. Her first text came at midnight, a photo of the set list with my initials doodled in the margin, like she'd been thinking about me mid-song. We started talking every day after that. First about music, then about everything. The kind of conversations that stretch until 3 in the morning. Sloan told me about growing up in Nashville, chasing a career her own father called a hobby with delusions of grandeur. I told her about nursing school, about holding strangers' hands through the worst night of their lives, about how exhausted and alive it made me feel. Neither of us said the word dating, but we started spending Saturdays together anyway, walking the lakefront until our feet ached and our voices grew hoarse. She wrote a song on her porch one evening and played it for me first, before anyone else, watching my face instead of her own hands. "It's about someone I met on a bus," she admitted, not quite looking at me, and my chest tightened with something I didn't have a name for yet. I hadn't kissed a woman before, hadn't let myself imagine it seriously, though something in me had known for years and simply refused the knowledge. The first time Sloan took my hand in public, on a crowded sidewalk near Wicker Park, I flinched. Not from her but from every eye I imagined watching. She noticed. She let go immediately, gently, and said, "Whenever you're ready." Not a second before, and somehow that patience frightened me more than pressure would have. I started noticing things I'd spent years ignoring. How I compared every man I dated to a feeling I couldn't name. How relief flooded me whenever those dates ended. One evening, walking home from her apartment, I finally admitted it to myself in words. I was falling for a woman, and I was terrified. Terrified of my mother's voice, of the church we still attended twice a year, of the careful, acceptable life I'd been building since childhood. Sloan never pushed. She simply kept showing up, kept saving me the good seat, kept playing songs that sounded suspiciously like they were about me. The night she finally kissed me, it was raining outside her building, and she asked first, quietly, "Can I?" before she ever leaned in. I said yes before I finished thinking it through, and the kiss felt less like a beginning and more like something I'd been circling for years. Afterward, she rested her forehead against mine and said, "I've been waiting 6 months to do that, and I believed every word of it." We didn't tell anyone right away. We built a private world instead. Small apartment dinners, playlists traded like secrets, mornings I didn't want to leave. Sloan's career started picking up speed around then. A song of hers climbing local radio charts. A booking agent finally returning her calls. I was proud of her in a way that surprised me. Fierce and unguarded. Cheering louder than anyone else in rooms full of strangers. She started writing songs I recognized instantly as ours. Small details only I would catch. A Tuesday. A bus seat. An earbud shared in silence. I loved her carefully at first. The way you handle something you're afraid might shatter if you hold it too tightly, too publicly, too soon. My mother called one Sunday and asked, out of nowhere, "Who's been keeping you so busy lately?" And I lied so easily it scared me. Renata figured it out before anyone, catching the way I smiled at my phone, and simply said, It's about time you looked this happy. I told her everything that night. And she hugged me so hard I nearly cried. Relieved to finally say Sloane's name out loud to someone. Sloane met Renata soon after. And they got along instantly, trading jokes at my expense while I pretended to be annoyed and secretly loved it. For a while. Life felt almost unbearably good. The kind of good that makes you brace yourself, half expecting it to be taken away. Sloane started talking about the future carefully, tentatively, asking if I'd ever consider meeting her parents, though she never pushed the subject of mine. I hadn't told my family anything. Every time I tried rehearsing the words in my head, my mother's disappointed voice drowned them out completely. Sloane understood, or claimed to, though I sometimes caught her watching me with a quiet worry she never quite put into words. "I'm not asking you to choose," she said one night. "I just don't want to be your secret forever." And I had no good answer for that. I promised her time, promised her patience, promised things I wasn't entirely sure I could deliver. And she nodded like she believed me anyway. That was the first crack. Small and quiet. The kind you don't notice until much later. Staring back at exactly when everything started shifting. My father's health took a turn that spring. A heart scare that sent my whole family into a tailspin of hospital waiting rooms and prayer circles. I flew home to Peoria for 2 weeks, leaving Sloane behind in Chicago with nothing but rushed phone calls between hospital shifts and family dinners. My mother, exhausted and frightened, leaned on me harder than usual, and old patterns crept back in. The good daughter, the reliable one, the careful one. One evening she mentioned, almost casually, a coworker's son who just moved back to Peoria. Single. Such a nice, steady boy, she added, watching my face. I said nothing. I let the silence answer for me. The same silence I'd been using with my mother my entire life. That night I called Sloane from my childhood bedroom, whispering so no one would hear. And she asked gently, "Are you okay? You sound far away." I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was disappearing back into a version of myself I thought I'd already outgrown. My father recovered enough to come home, and the crisis passed. But something in me had quietly retreated during those 2 weeks, and I felt it. Back in Chicago, Sloane noticed the distance immediately. The way I hesitated before holding her hand. The way I flinched at a photo she wanted to post. "Talk to me," she said one night. And I finally admitted how frightened I was. Not of her, but of losing the family I'd always known. She listened without judgment, though I could see it cost her something. Hearing me place her love on one side of a scale against my mother's approval. "I can't be the reason you lose them," she said quietly. "But I also can't keep being invisible so you don't have to choose." We had our first real fight that night. Quiet and devastating. Full of things we didn't quite mean but couldn't take back easily either. She left my apartment around midnight, and I let her go. Too proud and too scared to ask her to stay and talk it through. For a week we barely spoke. Both of us waiting for the other to move first. Both of us too stubborn to be the one who caved. Renata sat me down and said, bluntly, "You're not protecting your mother's feelings. You're just scared. And Sloane's paying for it." Her words stung because they were true. And I spent that whole week replaying every moment I'd chosen comfort over courage since we'd met. Sloane's music career, meanwhile, kept climbing. An offer to open for a bigger act on a short regional tour, 3 weeks away from Chicago, she told me almost as an afterthought, like she wasn't sure I'd still care to know. And that hurt worse than any argument we'd had. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. But the distance in my own voice was impossible to disguise, even to myself. The night before she left for tour, she came by unannounced, guitar case slung over one shoulder, eyes red from something I hadn't caused directly. "My mom found out," she said quietly. "She saw a photo. She's not speaking to me right now," and I realized she'd been carrying that alone. I held her that night without saying much, ashamed of how quick I'd been to protect my family's comfort while ignoring the cost to hers. "I'm sorry," I whispered into her hair. "I've been so busy protecting people who might never accept us that I forgot to protect you." She left for tour the next morning, and I promised myself, standing in my empty apartment, that I would finally tell my mother the truth. The 3 weeks she was gone felt endless, filled with late-night phone calls, missed time zones, and a loneliness I hadn't expected to feel so sharply. I drafted the conversation with my mother a dozen times in my head, rehearsing words that always sounded braver alone than they would out loud. Sloane's tour was going well, her songs finding new audiences each night, though I could hear exhaustion creeping into her voice during our calls. One night she called later than usual, voice thin, and admitted her mother had finally texted. One line, "We need to talk when you're home." I told her that was good news, a door opening. But Sloane sounded more frightened of that door than she'd ever admitted to me before. 2 weeks into tour, a photo surfaced online, Sloane and me from months earlier, tagged and shared by someone I barely remembered from that show. It wasn't malicious, just careless. But it meant the choice I'd been stalling on had suddenly been made for me by a stranger's phone. My mother called within hours, voice tight and controlled in the way that always meant she was furious and trying desperately not to show it. "Is this true?" she asked. No greeting, no warmth, just the photo I imagined pulled up on her screen. Glowing accusation between us. I said yes. Just that. One word I'd been avoiding for years, finally spoken, shaking, into a phone in my own kitchen. She didn't yell. She simply said, "I need time," and hung up. And the silence afterward felt louder than any argument could have. I called Sloane immediately, needing her voice, needing anything steady, and she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "It's out," I told her. "My mom knows. Everyone probably knows." And my voice cracked in a way I hadn't allowed it to in years. "I'm coming home early," Sloane said instantly, canceling the final tour date without hesitation, choosing me over an opportunity she'd worked years to earn. I told her not to, that she shouldn't sacrifice her career for my family drama, but she was already booking a flight before I finished the sentence. "You're not drama," she said. "You're the person I love. Let me actually show up for once instead of just singing about it." She flew home the next morning, and I met her at the gate, and for the first time in weeks I didn't care who saw us. We held each other in the middle of the terminal, unbothered by strangers, and something in me finally, quietly, stopped being afraid of being seen. My mother didn't call for 2 full weeks, a silence that felt heavier than any fight we'd ever had in 26 years together. My father called instead, gentler than I expected, and said only, "Give her time. She loves you. She just doesn't know what to do with this yet." Sloane's mother, meanwhile, surprised us both, showing up at Sloane's apartment unannounced with takeout and an apology that had clearly taken her weeks to build. "I don't understand it," she admitted, sitting stiffly on the couch. "But I understand I almost lost you being stubborn. And I won't do that again." Watching Sloane cry with relief in her mother's arms made me ache for a version of that same moment with my own mother, still out of reach. Renata reminded me that healing rarely moves at the same pace for everyone. That Sloane's mother's quick turnaround wasn't a fair measuring stick for mine. I threw myself into work instead of waiting, picking up extra shifts, trying to outrun the silence from Peoria with exhaustion and busyness. Sloane noticed, and gently called me out one night, saying, "You can't work hard enough to make your mother call faster. Let it hurt instead." So I let it hurt. I cried in our kitchen over spaghetti neither of us finished, grieving a relationship that wasn't gone but felt suspended in ice. 3 weeks after the photo, my mother finally called, voice steadier this time, and asked if she could come to Chicago, just to talk. I agreed, terrified. and spent the 2 days before her visit cleaning an apartment that didn't need cleaning, needing something to control. Sloane offered to stay away during the visit, to give us space. But I asked her to stay instead, ready to stop hiding either of us. My mother arrived quiet and formal, hugging me stiffly, glancing at Sloane with an expression I couldn't fully read. Somewhere between fear and grief, we sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where Sloane and I had shared 100 ordinary dinners, and my mother finally started talking. I always knew, she admitted, surprising me completely. Since you were 16 and cried after your friend Jenny moved away. I just chose not to know it. She told me about her own younger sister, my Aunt Ruth, who I'd always been told died young in a car accident, a story I'd never questioned. She didn't die in an accident, my mother said quietly. She left home at 19 with a woman named Delia, and our parents told everyone she died instead. I sat frozen, absorbing a truth about my own family that reframed everything I thought I understood about my mother's fear. I was 14, she continued, and I watched my parents erase her. I told myself I'd protect you from that by keeping you safe, keeping you quiet. But safe wasn't the same as happy, she admitted, voice breaking for the first time I could remember. And I think I finally understand that now. She looked at Sloane directly for the first time that evening and said, I'm sorry it took me this long. I was scared of losing you the same way. Sloane, gracious and steady, simply said, thank you for telling us. That couldn't have been easy, and something in my mother's shoulders finally relaxed. We talked for hours that night, decades of silence unraveling slowly, and by the time my mother left, she hugged Sloane too. Briefly but genuinely. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. My mother still stumbled over pronouns, still asked careful questions, but the door, the lease, had finally opened. I found myself thinking often about my Aunt Ruth, a woman erased from family history, and I promised myself I would honor her story properly someday. Sloane's career, meanwhile, kept accelerating. A bigger label expressing interest, a national tour offer landing in her inbox that would take her away for months. She hesitated to even tell me, afraid of reopening the wound tour talk had caused before. But I encouraged her to take it seriously anyway. I'm not going anywhere, I told her. And neither is this relationship. Just because you're chasing something you've worked your whole life for. She signed the deal 2 weeks later. And we spent one last quiet evening together before the tour bus schedule swallowed our ordinary life whole. The distance was brutal. Different time zones. Missed calls. Exhaustion on both ends. Love stretched thin across a country neither of us controlled. I threw myself into work again. Differently this time. Not to escape but to build something steady while she built her own dream elsewhere. 2 months into the tour, a rumor started online. Unfounded but persistent, linking Sloane romantically to her opening act, a singer named Dana Reyes. I told myself I trusted her, and I did, but the loneliness made every unanswered text feel heavier than it probably deserved to be. One night, exhausted after a brutal double shift, I finally asked her outright, voice trembling, "Is there something happening with Dana I should know about?" Sloane went quiet on the phone. A pause that lasted just long enough to terrify me before she said, "Nothing happened." But something almost did. My stomach dropped. She explained. Carefully. Painfully. A moment of vulnerability on a lonely tour night. A near kiss she'd stopped before it went further. "I stopped it because of you," she said. "But I should have told you immediately instead of letting you find out through your own fear." I hung up that night without fully forgiving her, sitting alone in an apartment that suddenly felt too big for one person's grief. Renata, ever practical, reminded me that almost isn't the same as actually, but she also said I had every right to be hurt by the secrecy. For a week, we barely spoke beyond logistics, both of us bruised, both of us unsure whether this was a crack or an ending. Sloane finally showed up at my door unannounced, having flown back on her one day off, exhausted, desperate, refusing to let the silence stretch longer. "I'm not perfect," she said, standing in my doorway, "but I love you enough to fly 6 hours just to say that in person." We talked for hours that night. Honestly, painfully. About trust. About distance. About the parts of ourselves we'd both been hiding out of fear. I told her about my own quiet withdrawals, the ways I still sometimes flinched at public affection, still carried leftover shame she deserved better than. We agreed to try again. Not naively, but deliberately. Promising honesty even when honesty was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. She flew back to the tour the next morning, and something between us felt different. Dirtier. Tested and still standing despite the cracks. A month later, my mother surprised me by asking if she could attend one of Sloane's shows, her first real gesture toward genuine acceptance. We flew to Nashville together. My mother nervous in a way I'd never seen her before, gripping my hand tightly through the opening act. When Sloane stepped onto that stage, she scanned the crowd the way she always did, and this time her eyes found both of us, together. She dedicated a song to the woman who taught me that love is worth every scary conversation, and I felt my mother's hand tighten around mine. After the show, my mother hugged Sloane without hesitation for the first time, whispering something I couldn't hear, and Sloane's eyes filled with tears. Later, Sloane told me my mother had apologized directly, admitting she'd spent years afraid of a truth that turned out to be beautiful, not shameful. That night felt like a turning point, the family I feared losing slowly, imperfectly, choosing to stay instead of walking away from me. 2 weeks later, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Sloane's manager, without her knowledge, leaked details of our relationship to a tabloid for publicity. The headline framed our story cheaply, reducing months of real struggle into a sensational hook designed to sell magazines and generate clicks online. Sloane was furious, calling her manager immediately, threatening to walk away from the label entirely if he ever exploited our lives again. "This isn't a marketing angle," she told him, voice shaking with anger. "This is my life. And hers. And you don't get to sell it." The label, surprisingly, sided with her, firing the manager and issuing a formal apology, though the damage to my sense of privacy still lingered. I struggled that week, feeling exposed to a world that hadn't earned the right to know our story, strangers commenting on things they didn't understand. Sloane canceled 2 tour dates to be with me, prioritizing my well-being over momentum she'd worked years to build. Without hesitation this time. "You matter more than any headline," she said, holding me through a difficult night. "I should have protected your privacy better from the start." We decided together how we wanted our story told. If at all, choosing to speak once, honestly, rather than let strangers narrate our lives for us. Sloane wrote one final song about everything: the bus, the earbud, the fear, the healing, and asked if she could release it, with my blessing. I said yes, finally ready to be seen fully, not as a scandal or a secret, but as someone worth loving out loud. The song, titled One Earbud, released quietly online. No publicity push, just honesty. And within days it had spread further than either of us expected. Listeners connected with its rawness. Strangers messaging Sloane about their own hidden loves, their own frightened mothers, their own long roads toward acceptance. My mother heard the song before I could show it to her, calling me in tears, saying only, "I finally understand what I almost cost you." The label offered Sloane a headline slot on a national tour, contingent on her performing One Earbud as the closing song every single night. She accepted, but only after asking me first, unwilling to build her biggest opportunity yet on top of my discomfort or hesitation. "This is our story," I told her. "Not just yours. Sing it." I'll be in the crowd every chance I can. Unafraid this time. The tour's opening night landed in Chicago, our city. The place where a bus ride had quietly rewritten both our futures years earlier. My mother and father sat beside me in the front row. My father's health finally stable. My mother clutching a tissue before the first song even started. Renata sat on my other side, grinning, reminding me one last time that she called this whole thing back when I still denied everything. When the lights dimmed for the final song, Sloane paused before playing, looking directly into the crowd, finding me the way she always somehow managed to. "This song is about the bravest person I know," she said into the microphone, "who taught me that love worth having is love worth fighting for." The opening chords of One Earbud filled the arena, and for a moment I was back on that dark bus, a stranger's hand near mine. I stood, unashamed, tears streaming, as thousands of strangers sang along to a story that began with two people and one shared earbud. After the show, backstage, Sloane knelt in front of me, guitar still slung over her shoulder, and asked a question I'd been quietly hoping for. "Maya Whitfield," she said, voice shaking, "will you let me keep sharing songs, seats, earbuds, and every ordinary day with you, for the rest of our lives?" I said yes before she finished the sentence, laughing and crying at once, surrounded by my mother, my father, Renata, and the whole life I'd almost given up. My mother hugged Sloane tightly afterward and whispered, "Welcome to the family," words I once thought I'd never hear her say to anyone I loved this way. We were married the following spring in a small backyard ceremony in Peoria. String lights strung low, exactly like the venue where we'd reconnected years before. My mother read a short passage about my Aunt Ruth, finally speaking her name aloud at a family gathering for the first time in decades. Sloane played One Earbud one final time that day, not for an arena, but for the handful of people who mattered most in our lives. I still keep that single silver earbud in a small box on our shelf, a reminder of the night I nearly let fear decide my whole future. We built a life neither of us had dared imagine on that bus, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, loud and unhidden and entirely our own. Some nights, driving home from a show, Sloane still reaches over and offers me one earbud, and I still take it without a second thought. I used to believe love had to be quiet to be safe. Sloane taught me that love, sung loud enough, can finally set you free. Andy.